What is up, people? Welcome back to The Question, where you have the questions and I have the answers. And I just finished my essay on this topic. I've been talking about it all week, and I've actually been ranting about it for the past year or so now. I'm going to make a YouTube video about it, so I don't have to talk about it ever again. I say I have to give a presentation on it in a month, but doesn't matter. This is going to be why Craig of the Creek might just be the best kids show ever. And without further ado, let's get started. So before I get started with this deep analysis into the show, obviously you can like whatever show you want. This is just my personal opinion that I'm going to back up with evidence. But if you prefer other kids shows because of nostalgia or other aspects, or what I'm going to say just is not as important to you, that's completely true. Completely valid. I'm just saying that this is why I think it's the best kids show ever. And maybe in like 10 years they'll come out with a better kids show. My opinion will change and I'll make a video about that show. But right now, because I'm on this like finished essay high, and it was a pretty damn good essay too. We're gonna talk about it. So for those of you who don't know what Craig of the Creek is a kids show that airs on Cartoon Network. It first aired in 2018 and it recently got renewed for its 5th season, which is what my essay was about. And the reason I think this is the best kids show is because it handles representation of both like racial, cultural, disabled representation, queer representation, trans representation. It handles it all very well. A lot better than I think most adult shows that try to give representation handle it, which is very, very interesting because there's a lot more pushback towards progressive shows, especially when they're aimed towards kids. A lot of those shows will be taken down pretty quickly, or they have to be censored or covered up, like Gravity Falls. They have queer characters, but you couldn't mention them because Disney's kind of homophobic. Or you have The Owl House, which was canceled because of the blatant representation, and Disney can't handle that because they're trying to pander to all audiences, both progressive and conservative. So the fact that Craig of the Creek is allowed to exist in its capacity, though Cartoon Network, I will admit, is more accepting and willing to produce queer media, I don't think there's been as much queer media surrounding Cartoon Network, like blatant queer media, as there has been in Craig of the Creek. And there has been, Adventure Time, which had queer characters, Bubbline, and there was Steven Universe, but those were more ambiguously queer, or at least with Bubblegum and Marceline, it was until like the very, very end of the show, and even then the actual one episode we had of them being queer with Obsidian was released on HBO Max, not on Cartoon Network. So even though Cartoon Network's a lot more progressive than Disney, they still have a lot of work to be desired, which I think is interesting that Craig of the Creek has been able to have 13 explicitly canon in-show queer characters and trans characters without being canceled. So there's that. But it's not only about the fact that they have extremely good representation, it's about how they choose to go about their representation. Because as I said, I think they do it a lot differently and a lot better than more adult shows or other kids shows, and here's why I think that. So Craig is the main character, and his family is black. And they aren't done with stereotypes, which is important. He is the main character, so it's not a tokenism thing. And they make sure the background characters are diverse as well, and not just there for tokenism. They actually have their own in-depth backgrounds and storylines that are explored throughout the running of the show. But back to Craig's family. His grandmother canonically went to Howard University, which is an HBCU, and she talks about her experience. She's a judge and she's an advocate for the community. His mother went as Missy Elliott for Halloween, which is a famous black rapper, and which is really, really important because not only are they black characters, but they are explicitly referencing black culture in non-stereotypical ways, but in real ways. Because most of the time what tokenism is when they include black characters or characters of color that could be portrayed by anyone. Like there's nothing important to these characters that could indicate that their race is part of their background or part of their character. And so the fact that they include these aspects within Craig's history and within Craig's story and his family story is incredibly important, because they're now saying that the main character's family is black, but not only is he black because we chose to do this for representation purposes, it's black because this is an important part of his story and it affects how the family acts around each other and how they grew up and their opinions on things. It's important, and also because we don't get a lot of representation in that manner, because we have shows with black main characters, but we don't show these characters going to HBCUs. Most kids don't know what an HBCU is, and this is a good introduction to them, that this is something that exists, that is an option to them, especially if there are black children of color watching this, which I think there are, which is why the show is so popular. So we already know that they are really good at racial representation because they include race as an integral part of the character's backstory and character development. But they also do very good cultural background as well. There are multiple characters within this show that speak different languages. There are characters wearing hijabs, characters who celebrate different holidays, characters who don't celebrate holidays. And those characters are all looked at in depth. And once again, they're not just stereotypes. That they have the anime kids, but not all the anime kids are Asian, or they're Asian children, but there are different types of Asian. We have characters who speak different languages, as I said earlier. There are characters who speak Spanish, characters who speak Bisaya, who bring multicultural snacks and food to the creek and share them with other kids, and no kids tease them or think they're gross. They just learn more about it and they accept it and they try it and they think it's good, or they don't like it, and that's that, because they're kids. And that's really important because it teaches kids through examples that this is what you do, that this is okay to happen. And that's something else I talked about in my essay that I like about Craig of the Creek, is that it does not follow a PSA format that I feel a lot of shows that I had growing up did. I don't think shows do that as much anymore, but they still show PSAs on Cartoon Network about bullying and about self-acceptance, but Craig of the Creek doesn't do that. It doesn't stop and be like, hey, some people wear hijab, and that doesn't mean there's anything like bad about them. It means that this. Or, hey, some kids speak a different language, and that's okay. It just shows them existing together. There's no big emphasis on it. It's natural, and teaches kids that kids like that exist, and that they've most likely grown up with kids just like that, who speak a different language, or who wear a hijab, or who bring foods they don't recognize to school. And that's something that I find really beautiful, because not only is it giving multiracial representation, it's giving multicultural representation in a way that doesn't call out or other the culture or student or kid in question. It just shows them as part of the community. It doesn't put an emphasis on the fact that they're different from the norms. I feel like a PSA format, while it is helpful, it puts emphasis on that student and being like, hey, they're different from the norm, and usually the norm is like white culture. And so the fact that they don't do this is really, really important to show kids. And then of course there's queer representation. There are 13 canonically queer characters in the show, I think, that I mentioned earlier, and they also go about representation in a very different way than a lot of other queer characters in shows. Something that I wrote in my essay was that there's no emphasis on identity. Like these characters are canonically and explicitly queer, but there's no emphasis to figure out your identity. There's no emphasis to validate your identity by being in a relationship, or to validate your self-worth by being in a relationship, which I think is a big one, because heteronormative shows often revolve around someone trying to get the girl or get the guy, or the fact that they need to be in a relationship so they don't fall behind. And this show doesn't do this. It talks about identity and acceptance and shows queer representation without doing the usual thing of, hey, they're in a relationship, they must be queer, I didn't know that. It shows them discovering their feelings and, you know, feeling different things on different characters. Like one of the main characters, Kelsey, is a canonic lesbian, and recently she was given a girlfriend in the show. But before that, how they portrayed it was just her blushing and being awkward around like powerful women, I say, being her other friends, but women that girls, her friends that she looked up to. And they showed that the same way that any kid gets a crush, you know? There's no explicit thing being like, oh my god, I have a crush on this person, or oh my god, I think I'm a lesbian, or oh my god, I might be gay. There's no talk about that. It's just acceptance. Like, it's like there's no need to discover something because nothing is out of the norm. The narrative is very queer in the sense that it's not the normal like social structure that we have here where everyone is assumed to be straight, and if you are realizing you're gay, it's like this big oh my god moment that you tell your best friend about and then it gets out, or you have to come out of the closet. No, kids in the creek are just doing what they do, and it's just accepted as normal. And as I said before about race and culture, it's very important to show that because it means that being straight isn't the norm, that the default is not straight. It gives the illusion that anyone can be anything, and that's accepted because there's no default. People just are. And as I said earlier, they also have trans characters, multiple trans characters, and that's represented in different ways. And that's the important thing, is that with race and neurodiversity and disability and queerness and trans, they're all represented in unique ways. They're all portrayed differently, which is important to understand because a lot of times progressive shows will represent one type of this identity, and that can lead to creating stereotypes and falling to this idea that, oh, you have to act this way, and if you don't, then maybe you're not this. It invalidates people's identity. So the fact that they're showing these things in a variety of ways makes it all the more real and relatable, because in reality, these do appear different ways. Everyone feels different things. So like, I'm asexual, and that's a whole spectrum of like people who like having sex, people who don't like having sex, people who are open to the idea, not open to the idea, and they all feel it differently. And so portraying these crucial identities in a variety of ways is very important. Like, as I said, there's a lot of multiracial characters or characters of varying races, and they all look different. You know, colorism is not a thing that's happening in the show. We have extremely dark black characters. We have light-skinned black characters. We have different facial features for Latina characters. We have different hairstyles, different hair textures, different types of Asian characters. It shows a variety of ways that kids can exist. Or even with neurodiversity, there are 2 kids who are canonically autistic, and it shows up differently for both of them. And as I was mentioning before, queer characters, trans characters portray differently. We have one character who in one season was very feminine and girly, and the next season they looked more stereotypically masculine. They asked, hey, is that Angel? They're like, actually, no, they go by Angelo now. And that's it. They just existed. But then there's characters who are genderqueer, characters who are trans, and they look the same, or they look differently, or maybe they look more androgynous, or maybe they look different. And they're just like, oh, they go by they, them. That's it. That's cool. You know? There's no big emphasis on you need to look one way. There's no big attention drawn to it. It's just something that the kids accept. And they accept all the different forms of this. They don't try and gatekeep and be like, well, you didn't do the exact same thing that Angelo did, so maybe you're not actually trans. Or you don't use these pronouns, maybe you're not actually non-binary. They just accept it. And that's something that's so important for kids to see. That there is no, you have to be like this in order to be valid. You know, you don't have to have this shade of skin color in order to be black. You don't have to be, you don't have to speak this language in order to be part of this culture. You don't have to use these pronouns to have this gender identity. You don't have to be in a relationship to validate whether you're gay or not. And this is a message that I think a lot of progressive shows lack, which is why I believe that Craig the Creek is doing exceptionally better than a lot of shows, because it reformats the way that we teach representation. It's not just about there being queer characters, or there being disabled characters, or there being BIPOC characters. It's this urge of acceptance and diversity within these communities. It's representing multiple ways that these people can exist, and that is just something that I love so much. Now, because it is a progressive show, whether blatant or not, progressive shows are pushing an ideal. And something that I love, and I mentioned earlier, that doesn't follow a PSA format, is that it talks about, even though the show is politically unaware, it never references political happenings or political debates or opinions that are happening in the real world in the show. That just doesn't happen. They do find ways to work in political arguments, or at least the core values of political arguments, into the show, and teach those to kids without making the kids aware of political happenings in the real world. So like I recognize this because I'm versed in political arguments a lot, and so I can recognize common arguments on both sides. And so I know when because they will put actual like political phrases or common arguments in the show, but it's not referencing what the arguments are usually referencing. But it's recognizable to adults, but it's not recognizable to kids, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that they will place politics in there in a way that kids can understand the message, but they don't understand that it's actually a political debate happening around them. A good example of this was a show in season 2 called Council of the Creek, where the council, which I'll talk more about later, was formed because a bunch of kids realized that the rules of this game they were playing was unfair, because a certain group of kids had an unfair advantage, which you can see what this is referencing, inequality in America. But what really got me was that one of the older kids said, well, the rules never affected me, so why would I care about it? Why would I want it to change if it's never been an issue for me? Which is a very common argument that conservatives have about systemic inequality, is that there's no systemic inequality there, or systemic inequality doesn't matter because they've never felt it, they've never been disadvantaged by it before. And while me and a lot of adults are going to recognize that argument and that that's exactly what they're referencing, kids aren't going to, because they're never talking about systemic inequality in America. They're just saying, hey, this rule is unfair because one group of kids is more likely to win than the other because of this one rule. If you take the rule out, the game is still going to be fun, but now anybody can win the game. And that's what kids are going to focus on, and that's what it's seeing, is that, hey, sometimes things are unfair, but it's really easy to fix it, and that doesn't change how good of a game it is. And that's really important for things to be fair. And kids are going to realize that they're talking about systemic inequality in America until they're way older, looking back on it and being like, wow, that was really clever. Like I'm saying right now, wow, that was really clever of them to do. Now, back to the Creek Council, which is also extremely clever because they talk about types of government and types of leadership within the show. Once again, not referencing America's government in any way, but by showing different types of government within the show, having the kids test it out and see what works and what doesn't, and why people use one type of government over the other. So a big part of the show is that there's Craig's side of the creek, and then there's another side of the creek, and on the other side there is another set of kids, and they, instead of having the Creek Council, they have a monarch. And in the beginning, the monarch was fun and the monarch was nice, but now there's a new king, and this king is kind of a dictator. He, makes sure that everybody does exactly what he does, and if they don't do what he wants, then he kind of socially outcasts them. And he has guards, and he persuades people, he bribes people with candy, and it's not nice. And they do a whole invasion series, I think in season 4 or season 3, and it's a lot of fun to watch. But So talking about monarchy, and they're not saying that monarchy is good or monarchy is bad. It's saying that anything can become bad when people don't feel heard and people don't feel represented. And I say this because they also talk about the different types of democracy within the Creek. Now I'm going to talk about the Creek Council. The Creek Council is basically, so the Creek is comprised of a bunch of different social groups, kids who form their own groups based on their interests. So you have horse girls, you have Tea Party princesses, you have the 10 Speeds, which are basically just people who like to ride their bikes and do bike tricks, and anime kids. And basically, each leader of the group forms the Creek Council. So they're the representative of their group, and what the Creek Council does is they vote on issues regarding the Creek. So, like, as I said, they voted on to change the rule of the game or not. They vote on group territory because each group occupies a different part of the Creek. And in the beginning, they decided it was going to be an absolute democracy. So nothing's going to be passed unless every single person voted to pass it or not. And that was going very well until they got to a point where no one could agree on something and no one could be persuaded. And so instead of trying to discuss it and change people's minds or come up with a new solution, they decided to convert it into a majority democracy, which is what we have in America right now. And so how that works, instead of everybody has to vote on something for it to pass, it's only the majority of it a majority of the people agree to pass it, it will pass. And the benefits of it is that they pass something faster and the majority of the people got what they wanted, but the people who didn't want that to happen felt left out. They felt that their leaders weren't representing them well, and they revolted, and they left the Creek, and they allowed for the other side to come in and take over because they didn't feel like their leaders were listening to them anymore. And this is very important to talk about because it is discussing how, what's currently happening in America right now is that we have this form of democracy, and sure, it's useful because we're passing things quicker than if we were to do an absolute democracy. But the issues with the majority democracy is that many people don't feel represented. And that can lead to civil unrest, which we see a lot in America right now because we don't feel like our leaders are representing us. And that's not a progressive thing that we feel like our leaders aren't representing us. Everyone feels like the leader is not representing them. Conservatives feel like progressive leaders don't listen to them. Progressive people feel like conservatives don't listen to them. And it's a mess. And it's not saying that majority democracy is bad because there are good uses for it. They got the thing passed. And it's a valid critique that, hey, sometimes people aren't listened to and that can cause problems. But it's also a valid critique of absolute democracy of, hey, this takes a long time. And if it takes a long time with like 10 kids, it doesn't take an even longer time with a population of over 1 billion. And so that's an ongoing debate within the show, is how best to lead the Creek, because these three forms haven't worked all too well by themselves, and they haven't come up with a way to make sure that everybody feels heard all the time while also being able to reach a decision in a timely manner. And it's really interesting for kids to learn this. And also, I feel like it places a lot of respect on children because kids do form their own societies. And I feel like a lot of kids shows normally talk down to children and assume that they kind of infantilizes them, that's the word. And Craig of the Creek doesn't do that. I mean, it's a show clearly targeted for a younger audience, but it treats them with respect and knows that they can handle these ideas without making them and trying to push a political idea. Like, they never bring up any political parties or ideologies. They just show kids figuring this out for themselves and allows the audience, the target audience, to reach their own conclusions and begin thinking about this. And by the time they get older, they realize that they've had these decisions and they've come up with these opinions long ago because they've learned. And that, I think, is something that's incredibly unique to Craig of the Creek that at least I haven't seen anywhere else. And that is why I believe it is one of the best shows ever, because it can do things like this in ways that other shows have not done before. I have to go to class soon, and my selfie stick died, so I'm kind of just holding my phone now. My arm is getting tired. So I have to go take my math midterm, but I hope this was very informative for you. If you haven't watched Craig of the Creek, I highly recommend it because it is, as I just spent the last however long doing, one of the best kid shows that I have ever seen. Um, is it perfect? No, but I think it's very close to that, and I think it's really important that not just kids, but everyone watches it at least once because it will change how, sorry, someone called me. It will change how you look at representation and political agenda and progressive shows outside of it. And because I feel like talking about the types of representation and what they mean and how they work is really important. So I think this is a really good place to start analyzing how representation affects people. So have an incredible day. So long, and thanks for all the fish. Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.